That's a cover-up. This paper is a fraud. It has not been retracted until today. And it's a fraud.
Where did it run?
It ran in Nature Medicine in March 2020.
Which I think is considered one of the most credible medical journals, right?
When I read it, when it came out, it was, I think, the most cited paper in biology or in medicine by far in 2020. Everyone wanted to know where this virus came from. I read it, and I went around knowingly telling everyone, oh, it's natural. You have to read Proximal Origins of SARS-CoV-2.
Because it never occurred to you they would lie in Nature Medicine.
Because this is the top of the heap of the scientific journals and the scientific establishment. The top. Nature. There are two great science magazines in the world that have a history that is so deep. One is Science, that's the US one, and the second is Nature, which is the British one. And Nature is the one that originally published Darwin, and it's so illustrious. And I was so smug, oh, you didn't read Nature, SARS-CoV-2, Proximal Origins, because you believe that stuff when it's written there. It's a fraud, that paper.
And it stands to this day.
To this day, they have not retracted it. There is, last week, a call by several scientists to the editor, a very clever one, calling for its retraction because, this is interesting, all in the weeds, but it's like everything we're talking about, the nonstop lying. The paper was to, as an important extent, honchoed by somebody named Jeremy Farrar, who at the time was the director of British Wellcome Trust, which is a huge foundation that supports biomedical research. And Farrar was working with Fauci to make it look like Nature. And so he was part of this group, but he's not a named author. And at the bottom of the article, this more details than you want to know, but at the bottom of the article, it thanks Wellcome Trust. Well, under the rules of science and under the rules of a journal, if there's a contributor who financed the thing but is not mentioned as a contributor to the article, that is per se a violation of conflict of interest standards. And that wasn't revealed. So just last week, a group of very illustrious virologists called for the retraction of this. I've called for the retraction of it because it's an outright fraud, because we have Slack messages and other email messages and other e-messaging that says, I don't really believe this, or, it's, in other words, it's clearly a fraudulent paper, but they're not moving to this moment.
But how can you, so there's a lot of debate about a pandemic treaty. WHO is, of course, pushing it. Lots of countries are as well, as you well know. How can you prepare for a new pandemic without establishing the origin of the most recent pandemic?
And more than that, we're going to have another pandemic. If it came out of a lab, they're still doing this work. It's not as if they said, oh my God, we really blew it. Now we stop gain-of-function research. There's gain-of-function research going on all over the place.
So, I mean...
And interestingly, Tucker, last year, almost like Monty Python, but it's so serious. Boston University put out a paper based on gain-of-function for manipulating SARS-CoV-2. And NIH says, you didn't ask for approval before doing that experiment. And Boston University says, we don't have to ask for approval. It's not on your grant. We're doing it like we want. And it shows we got a shit show going on in this country right now. If a university thinks it can do whatever it wants, and if NIH has a different opinion and we have no rules and they're doing work on dangerous pathogens, yeah, we're going to have another pandemic. Even if this one didn't come from it, this line of work is really dangerous. And who's watching it? Well, we don't know, because it's DOD, because it's confidential, because no one tells us anything. And interestingly, now the House investigation committee's trying to get at some of this. The Democrats completely surrounded Fauci and said, we don't want to have a look at this, and said this is Republican grandstanding. It's nuts. What could be less partisan than where this virus came from? And we can't even get Democrats in the House. Now I think a few of them are coming along, but for a time it was completely partisan. The Republicans could investigate in the House, but in the Senate, where the Democrats are controlled, they were saying no. And Rand Paul asked me to come in and meet his counterpart, who's the chair of the committee, Peters, and I did. And now, by the way, they are moving in the Senate because you got these bright red lights flashing. Holy hell, let's find out what happened.
Is it strange to wake up one day and all of a sudden see like actual threats to the existence of humanity right there? Nuclear war, bio warfare, possibly AI.
Yeah.
But just right there. I mean, what big picture, what is this? Did you ever think you would, after living in the most prosperous country in the world your entire life, find yourself in a place where the country you live in is basically causing, the potential extinction of humanity?
I think it's really true and important to understand that since 1945, we've been living this way. And we don't know it. We're barely aware of it. But the ability to screw things up in this world is very high. The ability to have terrible accidents. Oops, where'd that virus come from?
Yep.
The ability to have a nuclear war even by accident, but much less when you're in the face of your opponent and talking about defeating them and so forth. A war between two nuclear superpowers that we have normalized. We're not at war. We're just feeding them all the weapons, and and the British, who are the worst at this, they can use the weapons wherever they want. No constraint, no control. We've been living this way, but we don't know it because, like everything else, the narrative doesn't permit it. One day, Biden said I think it was the fall of 2022, this is pretty dangerous. We could be on a path to nuclear Armageddon. He didn't say that in a speech to the American people because he doesn't give speeches to the American people. He doesn't talk to the American people. He doesn't have press conferences. He said it at some fundraiser, as usual, and then someone reported it. What was the reaction of the press the next day? Almost to a paper, the reaction was, how dare he say these things? How dare he scare the people? How dare he say a word like Armageddon? There was, I think, an editorial in the Wall Street Journal, if I remember correctly, that this unforgivable, this kind of slip of the president of the United States. So
it's disgusting.
Biden, for a moment, blurted out the truth, no doubt by accident, no doubt because he was in some fundraiser, probably trying to impress some donor. But the reaction wasn't, oh my God, what does this mean? How do we consider this? Let's go back and think about unprovoked, and maybe we could decide how to step a little bit back from the cliff. And no, absolutely the opposite, completely the opposite. And I've seen, not only you could have a pandemic that kills an estimated 20 million people and not really care to find out where it came from. You can be on the brink of nuclear war. We can have Ukraine shelling the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. Do you know our newspapers won't say that it's Ukraine shelling the power plant? All they will say, and Ukraine is shelling the nuclear power plant, I can reveal as if it's a surprise, because the Russians are inside the power plant and the Ukrainians are trying to take back the power plant. And so these shells come to the nuclear power plant. And then our lovely
crazy.
Our lovely newspapers say each side accuses the other of shelling the nuclear power plant. And I happen to know, for the reasons that I know some of these things, that of course it's Ukraine shelling a plant that the Russians are inside of, not Russians shelling the plant but you can't get officialdom to say this. You can't get the newspapers to say this. That's pretty serious to be shelling a nuclear power plant. I mean, are you out of your... I put that on the list that we've been adding to. Yeah. Are you out of your mind?
Right.
Don't do that. But they're doing it.
In the country in the world that's actually had a profound nuclear accident already.
Exactly. You might mention that maybe they would know something about it, that there would be some reticence about
so that leads to my last sincere question, which you may or may not answer, but you're telling the truth about things that are they're big things, like the biggest things. And in a world where you're just absolutely, as you've noted repeatedly and correctly, you're just not allowed to do that. And you're telling the truth about people who don't care about the deaths of millions, who have caused the deaths of millions. So are you worried because you do have credibility, you're not a crank, and your job and your career give you just prima facie credibility? It's a big thing for you to say these things. Are you worried about the risks to you? Really?
I'm worried about the risks to me of a nuclear war.
For sure.
I really am. I spend a lot of time with diplomats. I really like diplomats, by the way. It's even when, countries hate each other or at war, good diplomats smile and talk to each other. And one could say, oh, how cynical, but it's actually quite nice. I believe the human touch is what can keep us alive, actually. I don't think it's a naive idea. It's actually a quite deep idea.
Russia has one of the greatest diplomats I've ever seen.
I think Lavrov is absolutely remarkable. And I've known him for 30 years.
Have you really?
Yeah.
It's funny, he in a fair world, in a meritocratic world, he'd be very famous. Even if you disagree with everything he said, because he's obviously smart.
He's astoundingly smart and astoundingly capable. And he's astoundingly someone that we should be speaking with.
I agree.
To find an answer to this. So the thing that makes it, if I were, shouting in the wilderness and it just felt it's insane, no one's listening, I'd have a very different reaction from the one that I actually carry day by day. Almost everyone I talk to around the world is worried, shares the things we're talking about, understands the risks, makes you feel completely normal, not abnormal in any of this, says, please keep doing this. Can you find a way to talk here or there? I've spoken twice in the UN Security Council or testified twice in the UN Security Council in the last 2 years. I want to make the diplomacy work because our lives depend on it. And we stopped all diplomacy in the United States. All of it, except what we call speaking with our friends and allies. But diplomacy is not speaking with your friends and allies. Diplomacy is speaking with your counterparts, even your adversaries. That's what diplomacy is, and we've got to get it back.
Do you think the average American, I said that was my last question, but I do have one more. Do you think the average American, even sort of informed people, has any sense at all of how close we are to annihilation?
I think people are worried, and people are not happy campers, and people do not agree with the foreign policy of this administration. But people are also very confused because we don't hear anything clear, except when you interview President Putin and we get to hear what he says. And think of, that was a monumental occasion, Tucker, and an extraordinarily important one, but how rare it is. And that's what made it also so extraordinary, because you're not supposed to do that. We're not supposed to listen to that. So I think Americans are, they know that something's wrong. They don't know exactly. How could they know what exactly is wrong? the level of trust in government is extraordinarily low. That low trust has been, unfortunately, amply deserved because our government lies and lies and lies, and it doesn't even try to tell the truth anymore. It tries to make a narrative. So I think people sense something seriously wrong. But God, I hope our lives are in the hands of a few people, and they better learn some prudence because they have not had it for a long time. And they don't even understand what it is to talk to a counterpart. And my absolute core bottom line is until Biden speaks directly with Putin and starts talking, our lives are deeply at risk. And it's unimaginable to me that we are in open war as we are, and we're not even trying to find the path to peace right now. And we have crazy statements that the president of Finland said, the path to peace is through the battlefield. These people don't understand anything. And I was just going to mention two quick things in closing. One, I spent a lot of my life studying the Cuban Missile Crisis and its aftermath, and I wrote a book about Kennedy's peace initiative in 1963, which was remarkable because he actually, in the height of the Cold War, reached the partial nuclear test ban treaty with Khrushchev, and they both knew we had to pull back from the brink because they both had advisors that would have led us to nuclear annihilation, and they were just completely shocked as the two people who had saved the world, but just barely, how close we had come. But one of the things that most people don't know about the Cuban Missile Crisis is that even when Kennedy and Khrushchev had reached an agreement, we almost had nuclear war after that event because of the disabled Soviet submarine. Do you know this event? Because it's one of the most remarkable, little-known facts of modern history, and it's worth understanding. After Kennedy and Khrushchev reached the agreement to end the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy removing the nuclear weapons from Turkey and Soviet Union removing the nuclear weapons from Cuba, and the U.S. promising never again to try to invade Cuba, there was a disabled Soviet sub at the bottom of the Caribbean that had been sent over during the crisis, and it blew a gasket, as it were, and temperatures inside 120 degrees, and the sailors fainting, and the ship deeply disabled. And this was 1962, so the communications did not exist. The ship was out of communication. They had no idea what was going on. So they decided to surface, and as they surfaced, American Navy pilots were dropping charges on the sub. And it's not absolutely sure, but one story is that the Navy pilot, one Navy pilot for fun, was dropping live grenades on the sub as it was surfacing rather than depth charges. And the pilot thought that they were under attack and that there was a war above the surface. Now, this was the lead sub of a squadron of 7 in the Caribbean, and it was the one sub in that squadron that had nuclear-tipped torpedoes, excuse me. And under U.S. doctrine, any attack by a nuclear weapon was to be met by the full force of the U.S. nuclear arsenal with an attack on across the Soviet Union, China, and all of the Eastern European countries. Estimate 700 million dead. And that was to happen with any nuclear attack. And Curtis LeMay was the head of the U.S. Air Force at the time, and he couldn't wait. I think it's fair to say.
Yes, it's fair to say.
So what happened was this skipper, the commander of the vessel, ordered the nuclear-tipped torpedo into the torpedo bay to be fired because he thought the ship was under attack. And by miracle, a guy named Arkhipov, who was the person who saved the world, whose name nobody knows, and I'm pretty sure I have the name right, was a party official that had a higher rank than the ship's captain, and said, I don't think that's a good idea. I think we should surface. And he countermanded the order at the last moment, and the ship surfaced, and they found out there was no war and no crisis, and that was the end of it. And we came within a moment of a full nuclear annihilation. Now, that's a true story. If people want to read about it in detail, the most remarkable book about this is a book by the late historian Martin Sherwin called Gambling with Armageddon, which is an absolutely phenomenal work. And Martin Sherwin, some people may recall, is the historian who's the co-author of Oppenheimer, which became the screenplay. He's a wonderful historian who died a few years ago. And he tells this story in unbelievable, riveting detail. Now, I take this not only as a literal event, but as a metaphor for our reality, which is something can always go wrong. Stay away from the cliff.
Exactly.
Stay away from the cliff. This is how close we are. Talk to President Putin. Negotiate with China. Make a two-state solution to stop the war in the Middle East. Stop carrying on like you run the world, because you don't.